Declaro abierta
The 9,982nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Under-Secretary General, United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, Ms. Natalia German, Executive Director, Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, and Ms. Elisa Deanda Madrazo, President of the Financial Action Task Force. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2025/496, the 21st report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL, Daesh, to international peace and security, and the range of United Nations efforts in support of member states in countering the threat. I now give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Voronkov.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I am honored to brief the Security Council on the 21st report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security and the range of United Nations efforts in support of member states in countering the threat. I am pleased to be joined by Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the Counter-Terrorist Committee Executive Directorate, Ms. Natalia German, to present this report, which was prepared jointly by our offices and the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. Many thanks to Mr. Colin Smith. I would also like to thank Ms. Elisa Deanda Madrazo, President of the Financial Action Task Force, for being present today. As we will commemorate the 8th International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism tomorrow, I take this opportunity to honor the victims and survivors of terrorism around the world. The International Day continues to elevate the voices of victims, raise awareness, and inspire global solidarity in countering terrorism. This year's theme, United by Hope, Collective Action for Victims of Terrorism, emphasizes the power of shared experience and collective leadership among victims and victims' associations to drive meaningful change at all levels. To mark the day, the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism will organize a high-level virtual event featuring messages from the group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism and senior United Nations officials. In addition, a global minute of silence will be observed, and a panel discussion will be led by victims and survivors from diverse backgrounds. UNSC will continue to work closely with member states and United Nations entities in further amplifying the voices of victims and in advocating for promoting and protecting their rights and fundamental freedoms. Mr. President, Excellencies, the threat posed by Daesh remains volatile and complex, with the group and its affiliates continuing to adapt and demonstrate resilience despite sustained counterterrorism efforts. While multiple Daesh leaders have perished in the past few years, the group has managed to retain its operational capacity. There is no indication that killing of its deputy leader in charge of operational planning, which resulted from counter-terrorism operations in Iraq in March, will be any different. According to member states, the group may recover from such loss within 6 months. Africa remains significantly affected, currently experiencing the highest intensity of Daesh activity globally. The situation in West Africa and the Sahel remains particularly urgent. During the reporting period, a resurgence in the activity of Islamic State in the Greater Sahara was observed, while Islamic State West Africa province emerged as a prolific producer of terrorist propaganda and attracted foreign terrorist fighters, primarily from within the region. Arrests in Libya have revealed Daesh-linked logistics and financing networks with connections to the Sahel. In Somalia, Daesh mounted a large-scale attack in Puntland in anticipation of a large-scale military counteroffensive. The attack involved numerous foreign terrorist fighters. During the counteroffensive by Somali security forces, 200 Daesh fighters were killed and over 150 arrested. Although significantly weakened, the group continues to benefit from regional support networks and remains a threat in the absence of sustained counterterrorism efforts. In the Middle East, Daesh stays active in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, working to restore its operational capacity in the Badi region and renewing efforts to destabilize local authorities. In the Syrian Arab Republic, the situation remains fragile since the takeover led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Daesh continues to exploit security gaps, engage in covert operations, and incite sectarian tensions in the country. The Secretary General's concern about stockpiles of weapons falling into the hands of terrorists has unfortunately materialized. Meanwhile, the security, humanitarian, and human rights situation in the camps and other facilities in the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic remains deeply concerning. In Afghanistan, ISIL Khorasan continues to represent one of the most serious threats to Central Asia and beyond. The group has targeted civilians, minority groups, foreign nationals, while exploiting discontent with the de facto authorities. The use of new and emerging technologies by listed terrorist groups remains a growing challenge. These groups continue to use encrypted messaging platforms to secure their communications, leverage crowdfunding systems to raise funds, and increasingly experiment with artificial intelligence to boost propaganda. Member States reports that Daesh may be seeking to recruit experts in cybersecurity. These are gravely concerning. Mr. President, Excellencies, as we are aware, United Nations is facing challenging times. Yet member states have remained united against terrorism. Despite differing views on the nature of terrorism and measures to counter it, they have consistently condemned in the strongest terms terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Allow me to offer some suggestions that the Council could consider in advancing counter-terrorism efforts while upholding member states' common rejection of terrorism. First, focusing on prevention. Time and again, the Secretary General has stated that prevention remains our best response to terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. It's more effective and cost-efficient to prevent terrorism than to remedy its impact. And recent years have shown focusing solely on the leadership of groups such as Daesh is not sufficient. Prioritizing long-term, principled responses that tackle the drivers of terrorism and the conditions conducive to its spread remain the most effective response to the threat. Second, compliance with international law remains essential. Terrorism and at times counterterrorism measures can have dire consequences. A case in point is the grave humanitarian and security situation in camps and detention facilities in the northeast of Syrian Arab Republic. Tens of thousands of individuals, primarily women and children, remain in prolonged detention under unsafe and undignified conditions. This environment presents serious risks of radicalization to terrorism and are contrary to obligations under international law. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for the safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation of all concerned individuals, with a particular focus on children, in line with international legal obligations and the best interests of the child. Third, engaging relevant stakeholders. In the Pact for the Future, world leaders have committed to pursuing a future free from terrorism. If that commitment is to become a reality, such a future cannot be materialized without the meaningful participation of all relevant stakeholders. In June, UNSC held a retreat of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact to enhance structured engagement between the United Nations and regional organizations. The event resulted in action-oriented decisions that will inform the engagement of compact entities with regional organizations in line with Action 23 of the Pact. UNSC will also continue to promote whole-of-government and whole-of-society approaches to countering terrorism. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the persistence of the threat posed by Daesh, despite significant national and international efforts, underscores the urgency of sustained global cooperation through counterterrorism approaches that are compliant with international law, grounded in human rights, and gender responsive. The United Nations Office of Counterterrorism will continue to prioritize capacity building, information sharing, and the delivery of tailored assistance to support member states in their efforts to counter terrorism. I thank you.
Agradezco al señor.
I thank Mr. Voronkov for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Natalia German.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I'm honored to address the Security Council on the 21st report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh and the United Nations efforts to support member states in addressing the threat. I wish to thank the United Nations Office for Counterterrorism, headed by Under-Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov, the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, led by Mr. Colin Smith, and all our United Nations partners for their contributions to the report and close collaboration with CETAT. And I also wish to warmly welcome the presence of the President of the Financial Action Task Force, Ms. Elisa Deanda Madrazo, and thank her for the strong partnership, in particular in the context of the recently published FATF Comprehensive Update on Terrorist Financing Risks, with France and CITED as co-leads. The report attests to a coordinated approach between CITED, relevant United Nations entities, and FATF in analyzing evolving terrorist financing risks and trends, and aims to support member states and all other stakeholders in understanding and addressing them. Mr. President, despite sustained international efforts, Daesh remains a persistent threat to international peace and security. Its ability to adapt and exploit instability continues to pose significant challenges, and in particular in parts of Africa. The continent bears over half of the world's fatalities from terrorist attacks. In the Syrian Arab Republic, Daesh seeks to leverage the volatile security landscape. The humanitarian and human rights situation in northeastern camps remains dire, where tens of thousands of individuals, the vast majority of whom are women and children, face extreme insecurity. Daesh Khorasan remains a significant threat in Afghanistan and also in Europe and in Central Asia, where it actively seeks to recruit and fundraise, relying on propaganda tactics and online campaigns. Daesh utilizes regional and domestic affiliates and receives substantial global donations using regional hubs and cross-border financial networks. Their financing methods mix digital innovations with traditional channels, making it harder to detect and suppress financial flows that support terrorism. Mr. President, in response, the United Nations has continued its efforts to support member states in addressing the threat posed by Daesh. On behalf of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, this year, CITED has conducted assessment visits to Cameroon, Chad, Hungary, Malta, Norway, and Somalia, identifying technical assistance needs and providing tailored recommendations to enhance implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions. In Europe, the visits demonstrated the persistent need for vigilance as the terrorist threat keeps developing with the sophisticated means to which terrorists are resorting. In Africa, the assessments focused on the evolving Daesh threat, as well as member states' capacities to respond. As of early 2025, Daesh Somalia has been playing an increasingly prominent role as a logistical hub for Daesh globally, though in recent months, Somalia and its international partners have successfully degraded some capacities of Daesh within Somalia. Funded by the United Nations Peace and Development Trust Fund and in line with the Security Council Resolution 2713, CITED, together with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and UNOCT, is providing support to Somalia and the region in countering Al-Shabaab's use of technology to raise funds and recruit new members. In the Lake Chad Basin region, Daesh is increasingly receiving foreign material and human support to conduct its operations, including money, drones, and expertise on improvised explosive devices. In the visits to Chad and Cameroon, we focused also on the return of former Boko Haram and ISWAP associates and their families, and the support needed to ensure accountability and sustainable rehabilitation and reintegration into the communities. In Cameroon, the delegation traveled to the far north region, the area most affected by terrorism, which is increasingly exacerbated by organized crime. In Chad, we discussed with the authorities their military engagement at the national and sub-regional levels through the Lake Chad Basin Multinational Joint Task Force, as well as advancing criminal justice frameworks and countering violent extremism leading to terrorism. Engagement with affected states in Africa and beyond has also been deepened through the European Union United Nations Global Terrorism Threats Facility, which supported legislative reform, capacity building, and cross-regional dialogues on prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration. Based on needs identified by CTED on behalf of the Counter-Terrorist Committee, the facility, which is implemented by UNOCT, provided support to Iraq, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, Malawi, Maldives, Nigeria, Somalia, Tajikistan, and Uganda at their request. In response to the terrorism situation in West Africa, United Nations agencies have focused on regional capacity development in countering the financing of terrorism. During the assessment visit to Côte d'Ivoire in November 2024, CTED commended the establishment of the Operational Coordination Committee, bringing together the Financial Intelligence Unit, investigating services, and judicial authorities. And as a result, Côte d'Ivoire delivered its first terrorism financing convictions, having benefited also from capacity building support from UNODC. Mr. President, Daesh's use of artificial intelligence and social media for recruitment, fundraising, and propaganda demands innovative responses. And although artificial intelligence is being harnessed to amplify the group's reach and impact, it also holds significant potential for states to enhance the detection, prevention, and disruption of terrorist activities. To counter the threat posed by new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes, CTED supports member states in the implementation of the non-binding guiding principles on terrorists' use of unmanned aircraft systems and emerging financial technologies. As we stand at the crossroads of technological transformation and geopolitical uncertainty, the threat of terrorism is more diffuse and complex. CTED is committed to work with member states to navigate those challenges in our common pursuit of a world free from terrorism. I thank you.
Agradezco a la señora.
I'd like to thank Ms. German for her briefing. I'm pleased now to give the floor to Ms. Elise Deanda Madrazo.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you for the invitation. I am honored to address the Security Council on behalf of the FATF to share our efforts to combat terrorist financing, which includes the financing of Daesh and its affiliates. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of CTED, Ms. Natalia Gurman, and Undersecretary General of the UN Office of Counterterrorism, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, for their insightful briefing, but mostly for the collaboration that we have on a regular basis. The FATF was originally created in 1989 to tackle money laundering, and it was mobilized just within 1 month of the attacks of 9/11 to also include in its mandate combating terrorist financing. Since then, the FATF develops understanding of the risks, and through a consensus-based rule, we set standards centered around effectiveness. We incentivize the members of the global network to bolster their defenses through rigorous peer reviews. And the FATF also partners with the private sector and the non-profit organizations to ensure both an effective and a proportional implementation of the measures. The FATF and the FATF regional-style bodies galvanize over 200 jurisdictions in strengthening their defenses to shield against terrorists. The importance of the FATF's role in countering terrorist financing has been acknowledged in a number of Security Council resolutions and complements the work of the United Nations. Since 2001, terrorist financing threat has changed dramatically, but the importance of addressing this threat is still relevant. By turning off the money tap, we can cut the blood supply of terrorism. The FATF regularly tracks terrorist financing risks, including through regular analysis of ISIL and Al-Qaeda financing. In June of this year, we completed a comprehensive update of TF risks. This endeavor would have not been possible without the professional collaboration of UN officials who, through CITED, collaborated as co-lead of this project, and also France served as co-lead of this work. This was made possible not only through their leadership, but also through the insights that we received from over 80 jurisdictions that included 800 inputs from the private sector and academia representatives. This report examines different types of financing groups and individuals, and of course includes detailed information on the financing of Daesh and its affiliates. What we see is that over the past decades, terrorists have demonstrated a persistent ability to exploit the international financial system. And these methods, the methods that they employ, vary widely. But we see a trend that underscores both their adaptability and their determination. Context really matters. Depending on the contextual circumstances, we see that the type of terrorist organizations, individuals, have different financial needs and consequently adapt their financing management strategies. Despite improvements in transparency and risk managing practices from the private sector, we see that terrorists continue to use the formal financial system, including deposit accounts, wire transfers, and prepaid cards. The major evolution is due to the digital transformation. Digital platforms, such as social media, messaging apps, and crowdfunding systems are increasingly being abused for terrorist financing, particularly when they offer integrated payment systems and they bypass due diligence measures. We see an increasing level of abuse of virtual assets, with some groups systematically leveraging them and applying them to obfuscate their techniques and shifting towards alternative promoted as more private and more secure. In particular, the report sees and highlights that in 2024, ISIL-K has increasingly used virtual assets for the organization's transfers and to collect donations internationally. To address this, the updated FATF standards support countries and the private sector to monitor the development of virtual assets and provide tools to identify potential underlying terrorist activities. In parallel, the threat posed by lone individuals radicalized by ISIL ideology, and these are often young in age, is rising, with such actors relying on microfinancing strategies that rely both on licit funds but also on petty crime activity, as well as technology-enabled methods that include gambling online, which we call gaming, and social media features. So while traditional financing channels and schemes continue, there is a marked increase in the interlink with diverse methods that use digital technologies. This adds to the complexity of the shields we have to put in place to combat terrorist financing. We also see an increased decentralization, with regional financing hubs and self-centered cells playing a larger role and adapting to local contexts and employing a broader range of funding sources. This includes from criminal activity, as we see ISIL in their African branches, to investment in business and activities. These financing models are more resilient and less vulnerable to traditional disruption efforts. This is, of course, a complex environment and highlights the importance of complementing the work of the FATF and the UN mandates in combating terrorist financing. The FATF has outlined a number of recommendations to address the existing and emerging terrorist financing risks. These recommendations build upon requirements of the Security Council resolutions and the guidance of the UN Security Council Counter-Terrorist Committee, including the Algerian guiding principles. First, this includes making multilateral designations of terrorist organizations under Security Council resolutions a key priority, alongside regional and national mechanisms established pursuant to UNSCR 1373. Secondly, strengthening implementation of the global CFT standards. The FATF is actively working to support countries to increase both their investigations and their prosecution's abilities, because we have identified that less than a third of countries are investigating and prosecuting terrorist financing adequately. There's also an area of opportunity in closing the loopholes, particularly in the area of virtual assets and transparency of legal persons. This is fundamental to choke the flow of funds to terrorism. Third, we're expanding outreach to broader stakeholders. This has to include non-traditional partners, such as social media and messaging platforms. It is critical to have a conversation with them and have them at the table to better understand and address these emerging risks. The private sector is often the first line of defense, and developing target public-private partnerships is critical. Lastly, and one of the priorities of the Mexican presidency in the FATF is both that government and private sector implement an adequate risk-based approach and a proportional implementation of the standards. Risk-based approach means succinctly defining the risks and applying the proportionate measures according to that risk. A general requirement for everything may not be the best approach to combat terrorist financing. The FATF has reiterated the importance of ensuring that the measures to combat terrorist financing do not impede activities conducted in accordance with international law, including humanitarian aid. To meet the terrorist financing challenges of today, we must recognize that our work is not yet done. The FATF takes on this challenge and will continue to work with partners and members of the FATF Global Network to combat all manners of terrorist financing. I want to conclude by thanking our valued colleagues at the UN bodies for their strong partnership, as well to acknowledge the hard work of the members of the FATF and of the Global Network that, as I mentioned, has over 200 jurisdictions. And I want to reiterate the Financial Actions Task Force continued commitment to work with the Security Council, all member states, and all relevant UN bodies to address the global risk of terrorist financing. We must stand together in this fight, because terrorists just need one time to succeed, and we need to achieve our goal by succeeding every time to prevent it. I look forward to hearing your views today on how we, working together, collectively, resolutely, can sharpen our impact in combating terrorist financing. The FATF stands ready to achieve this goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la señora.
I thank Ms. Deanda Madrazo for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary Vladimir Voronkov, Executive Director Natalie Herman, and President Elisa Deanda Madrazo for your briefings. The United States is deeply concerned about the continued operations and territorial expansions of Daesh, or ISIL, and Al-Qaeda. We have intensified our counterterrorism operations globally under President Trump, targeting ISIL and Al-Qaeda leadership, infrastructure, and financial networks. Notable successes have included the elimination of high-ranking ISIL attack planners in Somalia, Iraq, and Syria, and the transfer into U.S. custody of the man allegedly responsible for the Abbey Gate terrorist bombing in Afghanistan. These actions demonstrate our unwavering commitment to dismantling terrorist organizations and protecting international security. The United States continues to prioritize partnerships with allies and regional actors to combat terrorism. Through intelligence sharing and joint operations, we are working to strengthen global security and prevent the spread of terrorist ideologies. As the Secretary General's report outlines, ISIL Khorasan remains a key threat to international security. ISIL-K's recruitment of minors, determination to conduct global terror attacks, and its reign of bombings throughout South Asia and Europe is abhorrent and unacceptable. Mr. President, in Syria, we note that both Al-Qaeda and ISIL are actively fomenting instability by stockpiling weapons, recruiting fighters, conducting deadly attacks, and planning external operations. We urge all member states to work with the Syrian government to counter ISIL and Al-Qaeda and to support reforms of UN sanctions affecting Syria that will enable stability in the country. We especially call for the repatriation of ISIL-affiliated third country nationals who are displaced and detained in northeast Syria. Colleagues, in Africa, the United States is disturbed by the territorial expansion of Al-Qaeda affiliates, particularly JNIM's attempts to establish governance structures and ISIL in the Greater Sahara's consolidation in Niger and Nigeria. The United States commends those member states that have sustained the counterterrorism pressure in Iraq, Syria, and Somalia that has constrained ISIL operations. We also celebrate the successful disruption of terrorist financing networks, particularly in Somalia. Mr. President, holding perpetrators accountable for terrorist attacks and activities is essential to combating terrorism and preventing future attacks. We therefore call on the members of this Council to act decisively by designating additional ISIL and Al-Qaeda affiliates under the 1267 Sanctions Committee, ensuring their members face a global asset freeze, travel ban, and arms embargo. In this regard, the mandate of the Financial Action Task Force, the global standard-setting body for anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and countering proliferation financing, is distinct but mutually reinforcing to the work of the UN and its member countries. The recently published comprehensive update on terrorist financing, the first of its kind in 10 years, is just one example of the critical role the task force plays in informing the international community on the terror financing risks we all face. The United States commends the Financial Action Task Force for setting the global standard to combat these threat streams and for its great effectiveness in bringing countries and jurisdictions together to combat illicit finance. The United States also believes that duplicative efforts pursued by other international bodies are unnecessary and less effective. Lastly, as the Secretary General outlines, we emphasize that all member states must cooperate to address the evolving adaptability of terrorist groups, particularly their use of drones, cryptocurrencies, and decentralized networks to evade detection and sustain their operations. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la delegación de Estados.
I thank the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, President. I also thank USG Voronkov, Executive Director Gehrman, and FATF President Deanda Madrazo for their informative briefings. President, the ROK remains deeply concerned that terrorism continues to undermine international peace and security. The Secretary General's report once again shows that Daesh persists and adapts across the world despite concerted counterterrorism efforts. With sub-Saharan Africa becoming a new epicenter, Daesh affiliates in the Sahel are intensifying cross-border attacks and threatening coastal states. Daesh is expanding its financial and operational hubs in East Africa while exploiting instability and radicalized detainees in camps in northeastern Syria. Meanwhile, ISIL-K in Afghanistan poses a significant regional and international threat, exploiting sectarian divides while plotting attacks in Europe. Together, these global threats underscore the urgency of our coordinated actions to address the multifaceted challenges posed by terrorism. I would like to emphasize 3 points in this regard. First, foreign terrorist fighters, or the FTFs, should be rehabilitated and reintegrated through careful coordination among relevant states. FTFs continue to pose a grave threat to international peace and security, with a disturbing rise in activity across various regions, from Central Asia and Afghanistan to Eastern Africa. In Syria, the dire conditions in detention facilities in Northeast, where overcrowded camps are reportedly being used by Daesh to replenish its ranks, further exacerbate this challenge. Delaying repatriation or reintegration, however complacent, can no longer serve as a stopgap measure, as it will only spur further radicalization within the camps. A comprehensive program for FTFs is therefore needed more than ever. We call on all relevant states to actively engage with one another to find a mutually acceptable solution. We cannot afford Syria reverting to being an incubator for terrorism. Second, promoting respect for human rights in counterterrorism must be prioritized. As the Secretary General noted in his report, the dire conditions in Syrian detainee camps risk turning them into vectors of radicalization. This illustrates how humane conditions and legal safeguards can reduce the drivers of extremism. To uphold these principles in practice, all states should develop an oversight mechanism within its national counterterrorism framework tailored to its specific needs. Yet, these efforts can be more challenging for some member states, given their limited resources and expertise. As a small effort to address this capacity gap, the Republic of Korea has been implementing a collaboration project with CTAD this year. The project aims to ensure national security agencies in South Asia and Southeast Asia strengthen their oversight and accountability measures. It will deliver targeted capacity building and technical training to states to improve review mechanisms and investigations into alleged misconduct. We hope this project will serve as a robust foundation for promoting human rights in regional counterterrorism operations and invite regional states to join in this endeavor. Third, the new UN counterterrorism architecture should be reformed to ensure efficient coordination among all relevant entities. As we look ahead the future of the UN through the UN80 initiative, it presents us with a timely opportunity to strengthen coherence with the counterterrorism architecture. In this regard, we commend UNOCT for advancing the reform agenda and recognize this as an expression of its strategic leadership role, consistent with its founding mandate. We call for UNOCT to present proposals that enhance coordination among the compact entities. As a recent consultation between UNOCT and member states well depicted, the focus of the reform should remain in delineating respective roles and improving coordination among the entities rather than consolidating them. In this context, we reiterate our firm position that the new counterterrorism architecture should not condone any further duplications regarding capacity building mandates, which is also well reflected in the recent OIOS report. We look forward to UNOCT continuing to demonstrate its strategic leadership in this regard. I thank you, President.
Agradezco a la...
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me express our appreciation to Undersecretary General Voronkov, seated Executive Director German, and FATF President Deanda Madrazo for their comprehensive briefings and for their continued commitment to this critical agenda. Mr. President, allow me to highlight the following points. First, we remain concerned due to the persistent and dynamic threat that Daesh poses to international peace and security, despite its territorial losses and leadership setbacks. As noted in the Secretary General's report, the organization continues to exploit fragility particularly in conflict-affected or institutionally weak areas across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. The situation in Syria is of particular concern. The collapse of the previous regime has been rightfully welcomed, yet there is a security vacuum which a range of actors, including terrorist groups, continue to take advantage of. Greece reiterates its support for Security Council Resolution 2254 and underscores the urgent need for a credible political roadmap to address instability and prevent Daesh from returning. Second, we agree with the report's emphasis on the increasing regionalization of the terrorist threat. The expansion of ISIL affiliates in the Lake Chad Basin, the Sahel, Somalia, and the DRC calls for stronger cooperation between the United Nations and regional organizations, including the African Union. In this context, allow me to reiterate Greece's support to capacity-building initiatives that reinforce national and regional resilience, including in maritime domains where security gaps can be exploited by transnational criminal and terrorist networks. Third, we welcome the tangible progress achieved in repatriating and reintegrating individuals, particularly children, from detention facilities and camps in northeast Syria. However, the humanitarian conditions in these facilities remain alarming. We commend the UN's cross-pillar assistance to member states, particularly in Iraq, Kazakhstan, and Nigeria, and we encourage the expansion of legal, psychosocial, and reintegration support mechanisms. As underlined in the Secretary General's report, a purely security-based approach is insufficient. Rehabilitation and accountability must go hand in hand, especially for children formerly associated with armed groups who are entitled to protection and reintegration in line with international norms. Fourth, Greece strongly supports the continued development of the UN's counter-terrorism architecture. We welcome the work of the Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact and take note of the integrated, victim-centered approaches promoted by UN entities. We particularly commend initiatives aimed at protecting children and preventing their recruitment by terrorist groups in line with Resolution 2427, as well as the UNOCT's support for women-led reintegration efforts, an important contribution to the WBS agenda. Fifth, we are alarmed by Daesh's use of emerging technologies and artificial intelligence tools to spread propaganda and radicalization. We urge all member states to enhance digital resilience while safeguarding fundamental freedoms. Combating online incitement must remain a priority for international cooperation, especially as terrorist narratives evolve rapidly. Finally, Greece firmly condemns the illicit trafficking of cultural property and antiquities by terrorist groups like Daesh, which not only destroys the heritage of humanity, but also serves as a source of financing for violent extremism. We stress the importance of implementing Security Council Resolutions 2199 and 2347, as well as the most recent General Assembly Resolution 79/133 of 2024, which Greece co-sponsored, reaffirming the need for stronger international action and accountability across the cultural property trade chain. Mr. President, Greece remains fully committed to the implementation of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy and reiterates its unwavering support for the work of the Office of Counter-Terrorism, CTED, and the monitoring team. A coordinated, rights-based, and preventive approach remains the only path forward, one that strengthens the rule of law, protects the most vulnerable, and promotes sustainable peace. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also begin by thanking Undersecretary General Voronkov and Executive Director German for their thorough briefings. We have listened attentively to Ms. Madrazo's remarks. We also take note of the Secretary General's 21st report on the threat of ISIS, which provides a crucial basis on our discussion today. The global efforts to counter terrorism has achieved meaningful progress. Still, as the Secretary General's report makes it clear, our task is far from complete. Terrorism continues to adapt and persist, testing our shared commitment to peace and security. In light of this, allow me to highlight the following points. First, terrorism threat is neither static nor confined. It's evolving with a troubling shift toward the African continent. Groups such as ISIS and their affiliates have shown an alarming capacity for adaptation, redirecting their strategies and resources to exploit instability and weak governance. This flexibility demands a response that's equally agile and unified, particularly in support of African nations now bearing the brunt of these threats. As we have heard from the briefers, the role of technology further complicates the challenge as terrorist groups increasingly leverage digital platforms to recruit, organize, finance their operations. Yet, these same technologies' advances can empower us to bolster prevention, enhance coordination, and improve intelligence sharing. Second, the path to success lies in both deeper international cooperation and genuine national ownership. Somalia's experience stands as a testament to this approach. Our battle with violent extremism has shown that military solutions alone are insufficient. A truly effective response must integrate political, economic, and ideological fronts. In recent weeks, collaboration between our security forces and our international partners, including the United States, have demonstrated the strength of collective action, resulting in the neutralization of many ISIS fighters, including foreign nationals from mostly neighboring countries. This underscores the importance of technical assistance, regional cooperations, intelligence sharing, and enduring partnerships. In the wider continent of Africa, it's vital to secure sufficient, reliable, and predictable funding for AU-led peace operations and to fully implement Resolution 2719 of 2023. It's important to strengthen the United Nations collaboration with regional organizations such as the African Union and leverage their distinctive expertise and deep-rooted experience. The African Union's own counterterrorism initiatives, including the African Union Mechanism for Police Cooperation and Nouakchott and Djibouti processes, are critical to this effort. Such cooperation not only amplifies regional strength, but also reinforces our shared responsibility to uphold peace, stability, and sustainable development across the African continent and beyond. Third, prevention must form the cornerstone of our strategy. We must look beyond security measures to address the root conditions of poverty, lack of education, unemployment, and social exclusion that creates a fertile ground for violent extremism to take root. The role of youth, particularly, is significant. Young people are vulnerable to recruitment, yet also uniquely positioned to catalyze positive change within their communities. It's essential to invest in education, expanding economic opportunities, and encouraging civic participation among the youth in order to build resilience and diminish the pull factors of extremist ideologies. Sustainable development coupled with targeted support for most affected countries remain our strongest shield against radicalization. Lastly, the protection of civilians, especially those most vulnerable, must remain central to any counterterrorism measures and firmly grounded in international humanitarian law. Our strategies must place civilian safety at the heart of our actions, ensuring that counterterrorism measures do not inadvertently inflict new hardships or foster grievances that can be exploited by terrorist groups. Only by safeguarding those most at risk can we nurture the trust and resilience necessary for lasting peace. In closing, Mr. President, the fight against terrorism is a universal challenge, one that requires our ongoing dedication, a strengthened cooperation, and a steadfast resolve. The true measure for our success lies in our unwavering commitment to security measures that are firmly anchored in the rule of law and the guiding tenets of the UN Charter, ensuring they reflect and never undermine the foundation values that unite our international community. My delegation reaffirms its commitment to combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations while upholding the principles of peace, dignity, and justice for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of Somalia. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
I thank Under-Secretary General Voronkov, Executive Director German, and the Financial Action Task Force President Deanda for their briefings. As we have heard, Daesh and its affiliates continue to pose a serious and evolving threat to international peace and security. I will make 3 points. First, Daesh continues to spread terror across multiple regions. Collective pressure is required to prevent them from regrouping to the levels we have seen previously. In South Asia, counter-terrorism efforts against ISKP, led by Pakistan, have been instrumental in diminishing the group's capabilities. In Iraq, the United Kingdom contributes to the combined Joint Task Forces operation Inherent Resolve, which, in partnership with Iraq's armed forces, has effectively suppressed Daesh and enhanced regional security. In Syria, there is renewed hope for lasting peace and security, but the threat from Daesh remains. We must ensure that Daesh cannot exploit the current political transition to regain a foothold in that country. And across Africa, Daesh attacks have increased, and it has used its appalling violence as a source of propaganda. We support African-led initiatives to combat this threat. Second, Daesh continues to adapt, leveraging propaganda to radicalize and recruit its supporters. It aims to expand its influence by manipulating narratives and exploiting societal divisions. To counter this, we should invest in comprehensive strategies addressing both upstream drivers of radicalization and downstream manifestations of violence. The United Kingdom's Counter-Daesh Communications Cell has a strong track record in contesting Daesh's narrative and degrading its ideological appeal. Third, the United Kingdom welcomes the focus FATF has given to countering terrorist financing under the leadership of President Deanda. FATF and its global network have helped member states to achieve meaningful and sustained reforms through their robust monitoring and accountability process. Their work assists our collective understanding and response to current and emerging terrorist finance risks. Finally, the enduring threat posed by Daesh demands unified and sustained international pressure. The United Kingdom remains committed to working with all partners to combat Daesh and its twisted ideology, and to guard against the threat it poses to international peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Undersecretary General Voronkov and Executive Director German for the report and the teams and entities that contribute to its preparation. I also thank Ms. Deanda Madrazo for her remarks. Mr. President, this is the last briefing on this topic during Slovenia's Security Council tenure, throughout which the threat of Daesh and its affiliates has remained consistent. It has been re-emerging in some parts of the world, such as the Middle East, and intensifying in Africa, especially West Africa and the Sahel. In this regard, let me highlight the following points. First, according to the report, even the removal of a key figure of Daesh's leadership has set back the group's global network for only about 6 months. This demonstrates its resilience and adaptability. It underscores the need to complement kinetic responses with comprehensive, inclusive, and gender-responsive strategies that address the underlying drivers of terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Such measures must be implemented in accordance with international law, human rights, and the rule of law. These efforts should adopt whole-of-government and whole-of-society approaches, particularly focusing on youth, prioritizing their education, socioeconomic opportunities, and community engagement to stem the flow of new recruits. It is equally important to meaningfully include and recognize the role of women and women-led organizations in prevention and de-radicalization activities. Special attention must be paid to new technologies and digital tools, which play a pivotal role in modern society, but are increasingly exploited for terrorist purposes, such as online propaganda, recruitment, financing, and operations. Second, during the latest reporting period, the most significant developments for the group occurred in Syria, where the situation remains fragile. Daesh has been working towards rebuilding its network and operational capacity, while also aiming to undermine stabilization efforts of the interim authorities. Particularly concerning are the group's efforts to replenish its rank also by calling on foreign terrorist fighters to travel to Syria. We welcome the transitional authorities' stated commitment to combating terrorism and extremism. It is imperative that they keep up the efforts and that no space is left for the resurgence of Daesh or any other terrorist group within the territory of Syria. We're especially alarmed by the security, human rights, and humanitarian conditions in the camp in the northeast of the country, where majority of population are minors. They are particularly vulnerable to radicalization, and many are being recruited to join Daesh. Now more than ever, it is essential to retain and strengthen security and administration of the camps, including the provision of basic services. All states should work towards the safe and dignified repatriation of their nationals, while ensuring accountability for crimes committed in line with international norms and standards. Third, we thank the UNOCT for providing an overview of the technical assistance and capacity building efforts in support of member states. Since the Secretary General's report on the threat of Daesh is a strategic level document, we believe it would be relevant to include the results of these efforts in line with the results framework mandated by the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. This could also enable an assessment of their impact on the threat posed by Daesh. Mr. President, to conclude, international community has set up several tools to fight terrorism. From 1267 ISIL and Al-Qaeda sanctions regime to capacity building support under coordination of the UNOCT. They are most effective when utilized fully, both in the regional and global cooperation frameworks. However, the fight starts on the ground by giving people, communities, and society means and opportunities for building resilience. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of Slovenia. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Voronkov, Executive Director German, and FATF President Deanda Madrazo for their comprehensive briefings. Terrorism continues to be a grave threat to international peace and security, undermining the rule of law, destabilizing states, and causing immense human suffering. Guyana unequivocally condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations and underscores the importance of adopting a comprehensive and multifaceted approach to counter terrorism, an approach that is focused on prevention, protection, and accountability. We are deeply concerned by the indication in the Secretary General's 21st report that despite sustained counter-terrorism pressure, the threat posed by Daesh and its affiliates to international peace and security remains undiminished and is characterized by adaptability and resilience of the group. Mr. President, while robust security measures are essential to prevent and respond to terrorist attacks, it is equally crucial to address the underlying conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. As we have seen, political instability, weak governance, and conflict provide fertile ground for terrorist activities. Other drivers include poverty, inequality, political exclusion, human rights abuses, which can be exploited by terrorist groups to recruit and radicalize individuals, particularly youth and children. We are concerned by the report of growing youth leadership in Daesh and the continued experimentation with different communication platforms to glorify violence and promote an idealized life under the group's rule. This is compounded by the use of artificial intelligence to enhance propaganda efforts and the algorithmic influence of certain social media platforms to radicalize and recruit youth to terrorism. To combat this trend, there must be greater investments in the education and empowerment of youth. Increased youth representation in decision-making processes for anti-terrorism laws and policies will also have a positive impact. Mr. President, the close link between underdevelopment and terrorism cannot be overemphasized. In sum, there can be no peace without sustainable development and no sustainable development without peace. While we recognize the progress of counterterrorism efforts in constraining activities of Daesh in the Middle East and the attrition of its leadership, we are concerned by the group's shift to parts of Africa and the high intensity of terrorist activities recorded there. On that note, we call for stricter management of stockpiles of weapons and ammunition in order to keep them out of the hands of terrorist groups. We are also concerned by the evolving tactics of terrorist groups, including their increasing use of new and emerging technologies for propaganda, recruitment, financing, and planning and executing of attacks. The phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters and the nexus between terrorism and organized crime also pose significant challenges that demand our urgent attention and concerted action. Guyana underscores the imperative of upholding international law, including international human rights law, international refugee law, and international humanitarian law in all counterterrorism measures. We emphasize the critical importance of ensuring accountability for terrorist attacks and activities as part of efforts to deter such acts in the future. Mr. President, international cooperation remains the cornerstone of effective counterterrorism efforts. No single nation can combat this transnational threat alone. We must strengthen our collective resolve and enhance collaboration in areas such as intelligence sharing, law enforcement cooperation, border management, and capacity building, particularly for developing countries. The Security Council has a vital role in global efforts to eradicate terrorism. Let us maximize the use of the tools available to us, particularly sanctions. Requests for exemptions should be closely scrutinized. We commend the tireless efforts of the United Nations in delivering critical and wide-ranging support to member states in their efforts to fight terrorism, including in countering the movement of terrorists across borders, enhancing efforts to counter the financing of terrorism, strengthening responses to the use of digital and emerging technologies by terrorists, and supporting victim assistance program. In conclusion, Guyana remains steadfast in its commitment to contributing to global efforts to counter terrorism. We will continue to work closely with all stakeholders to implement relevant Security Council resolutions and the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy towards realizing a more peaceful and secure world for all. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank USG Voronkov, Executive Director German, and President Deanda for their briefings. Terrorism is a common enemy of humanity in a context of growing volatilities and recurrent hotspot issues in the international landscape. Threats posed by terrorism are re-emerging across the world. High-profile terrorist attacks are rising in both numbers and frequency, resulting in increasing casualties and repercussions. The international community needs to strengthen unity and cooperation and steer clear of ideological biases and geopolitical calculus to build a strong united front against terrorism and jointly counter terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Today, let me illustrate with three specific counterterrorism settings. First, Syria. Over the past half year, terrorist groups like ISIL and ETIM have exploited the instability in Syria to expand their reach, recruit fighters to their ranks, loot weapons, and launched frequent attacks. Foreign terrorist fighters stationed in Syria are moving across borders and projecting a serious threat to regional security. As indicated in the report of 1268 Committee Monitoring Team, ETIM /TIP alone has several thousand militants within Syria. The international community must urge the Syrian interim authorities to effectively fulfill its counterterrorism obligations and resolutely counter all council-listed terrorist organizations, including ISIL and ETIM/TIP. Given the lingering complexities and challenges in Syria on the counterterrorism front, it begs the question, what implications and effects will follow from adjusting Council sanctions regime on Syria now? Does the Syrian interim authorities have the capacity and means to follow up on the said adjustments? Will the adjustments create loopholes for the terrorist organizations in Syria? It is important for us to make judicious decisions based on a careful study of these questions. Second, Afghanistan. As indicated in the SG's report, terrorist groups such as ISIL-K, Al-Qaeda, ETIM/TIP, TTP, and BLA and its Majid Brigade are collaborating with one another and remain active in Afghanistan and South Asia, orchestrating a series of heinous terrorist attacks. We call on the Afghan interim government to step up counterterrorism efforts and root out all terrorist forces within its border. We call upon countries in the region to enhance political trust and make full use of platforms like Shanghai Cooperation Organization to strengthen practical counterterrorism cooperation. We noted that the United States government has recently designated BLA and its Majid Brigade as terrorist organizations. We hope the Council can follow suit and include this organization in the 1267 sanctions list as soon as possible. Third, Africa. The SG's report indicates that ISIL continues to pivot towards Africa, taking over cities, making territorial gains and attacking civilians, and resulting in massive losses and heavy strains in many affected countries. The international community should, on the basis of respecting state sovereignty, provide greater financial, technical, intelligence, and logistical support to African countries and help AU and other regional organizations enhance their counterterrorism capacity. The Council should endeavor to facilitate the settlement of hotspot issues and engage enhanced dialogue and cooperation with the countries concerned and regional organizations to promptly diffuse conflicts and disputes and relentlessly diminish the environment prone to terrorism and the soil breeding terrorist forces. President, UNOCT, CTED, 1267 Committee Monitoring Team and FATF have made active efforts in tracking global counterterrorism evolutions and promoting global counterterrorism cooperation. China commends them for their efforts. We encourage relevant UN counterterrorism bodies to further strengthen coordination and coherence in implementing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. The Council should continue giving prior place to counterterrorism on its agenda and effectively leverage mechanisms such as 1267, 1988, and 2713 sanctions regimes in support of counterterrorism operations by individual states and counterterrorism efforts globally. President, China resolutely opposes terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Over the years, under the Global Security Initiative, China has been helping other developing countries, especially those in Africa, to build their CT capacity through bilateral and multilateral avenues. Through the China UN Peace and Development Trust Fund, we have supported countries in the Sahel with CT operations and financed UNOCT's program office in Kenya and helped enhance the CT capacity of African countries with UAV technologies. We stand ready to work with all partners to advance the global counterterrorism agenda and actively contribute to a world with lasting peace and universal security. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank Mr. Vladimir Ivanovich Voronkov and Natalia Mirchenova-German for their substantive briefings on the work of the departments they head up. We highly commend the work of the UN Office of Counterterrorism and the Executive Directorate of the Counterterrorism Committee of the UN Security Council. Russia is prepared to continue to lend them full support for their relevant mandates to be implemented effectively in the interests of all member states. Today's meeting is an excellent opportunity for a comprehensive analysis of the situation in countering terrorism, identifying problem areas, and defining specific steps to eradicate them. We have carefully studied the latest report of the UN Secretary-General on threats posed by ISIL. We agree with the report that the threats posed by this international terrorist organization are not decreasing in number. The group is adapting to new circumstances, including by changing the geographical area of its activities. It is increasingly active in Africa. The report notes that to take root there and to expand its presence, ISIL fighters are tapping into a number of factors: political instability, weak state governance, and armed conflicts. For us, it is clear that this is not a full picture. The picture once again fails to include a key point: the role of the interference of countries of the West in the domestic affairs of states in the region. The events of recent decades have clearly shown who has paved the way for terrorists coming to Africa. The devastation of state institutions in Libya and Iraq as a result of intervention by NATO countries has created long-term power vacuums and security vacuums that have been harnessed by the fighters. Today, in the pursuit of their geopolitical interests, the former metropoles are continuing to support illegal armed formations in Africa and also to exploit local tensions and socioeconomic problems. The stubborn ignoring of such factors in the relevant analytical materials of the Secretariat not only warps the real picture, but also hampers the development of effective measures. If the real reasons for instability are not fully laid out, then the decisions aimed at are not going to be sufficiently effective. We firmly condemn the use by individual Western countries of terrorism as an instrument of their neocolonial policies. African states have repeatedly underscored that instead of the pledged support, they have actually received destabilizing activities and subversive activities. This clearly explains the ineffectiveness of the years-long so-called counterterrorism operations. Using the phrase counterterrorism has purely served as an excuse for foreign military presences that were not necessary. France has particularly set itself apart with these dubious approaches. The representatives of countries in the region regularly share intelligence information that Paris is in contact with terrorist groups and is supporting them. So this is in the vain attempt to keep their elusive control of their former colonies. In this regard, once again, we'd like to underscore that international counterterrorism assistance should be provided solely on the request of the states. Furthermore, specific assistance measures must respect the sovereignty of the requesting state and should not allow for interference in its domestic affairs. We support the decisions of countries in the region to curb the presence of foreign military contingents whose actions did not comply with those principles. This particularly pertains to those situations whereby, using the excuse of counterterrorism, former colonial powers de facto have maintained and expanded their military presence, thus violating the fundamental principles of international law, including the UN Charter. Mr. President, specific attention in this context should be paid to the actions of the Kiev regime in Africa. There are specific facts, evidence. For example, the Ukrainian Special Services, including the Ministry of Defense, have been involved in subversive activities in Sahel countries and in other regions in Africa. They are supplying weapons and drones to fighters. They're training them how to use them. They're coordinating the actions of terrorists, including JNIM in Mali. They're deploying trained mercenaries for attacks on local governments. All of this requires careful international investigation using the UN's comprehensive relevant mechanisms. Mr. President, in line with Security Council Resolution 2734, the Secretary-General's report on threats posed by ISIL should contain specific reports on large-scale threats, sources of terrorist financing, including through the illegal trade of artifacts, oil and other natural resources inter alia. Unfortunately, this document has paid minimal attention to these issues. We cannot avoid the serious problem of the diversion of weapons to terrorists. The report just tangentially mentions this, but the facts speak for themselves. During the operation to eradicate ISIL's cells, stockpiles of Western and Eastern European weapons were repeatedly found. So Western weapons supplied to the corrupt Kiev regime are continuing to flow into different regions of the world, including the areas where ISIL and Al-Qaeda are active. Furthermore, a section of the report on the support of member states from the UN does not have any information about specific results achieved. We cannot consider here the trite listing of events, seminars and projects and programs in that capacity. In future documents, we would like the focus to be on what results on the ground have managed to be achieved through UN support. We were unpleasantly surprised by the inclusion in this report of information about political dialogues on the interlinkages between counterterrorism and peacekeeping. We do not agree that these events are able to lay a basis for future reviews for the architecture of peacekeeping and the latest review of the global counterterrorism strategy of the UN. I'd like to say that we're talking here about meetings of individual states who are ramming through their narrow agendas with individual UN structures. Their approaches, which allow muddling of the peacekeeping and counterterrorism agendas, do not enjoy universal support. These are two standalone areas. Each one of them require their own instruments and resources. Artificially combining them may undermine the effective achievement of the principal aims to eradicate the terrorist threat. Mr. President, the report contains worrying signs that ISIL and its affiliates are actively using modern technology, including AI. This is not an abstract threat. We're talking about the establishment and spreading of disinformation, automating recruitment and planning, and quickly controlling terrorist attacks. We are convinced that in this area, the UN and member states must act proactively. Of key importance here is cooperation without politicization and double standards. In this regard, I'd like to underscore that Russia has consistently advocated for fair, depoliticized and results-based ways of combating terrorism without any hidden agendas. We are open to cooperation with member states and UN structures based on the principles of the UN Charter, primarily the sovereign equality of states and non-interference in domestic affairs. International cooperation alone, based on mutual respect and dialogue, can help to achieve a lasting decrease in the terrorist threats and will help to increase international security. In conclusion, we cannot fail to mention that the non-constructive, politicized approach of one delegation meant that the Council could not agree on a standard draft press statement regarding the terrorist attack in Iran in Zahedan on the 26th of July. This is now becoming an unpleasant tradition. Individual Security Council members are increasingly refusing to condemn terrorist attacks. Sometimes they're desperately trying to justify them. We would urge all Council colleagues to recall that the main aim of our work in counterterrorism is that terrorism is not and can never be justified, irrespective of its forms and manifestations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Under Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov for his insightful briefing. And I also thank Executive Director CTAD Natalia German and FATF President Elisa Deanda Madrazo for their remarks. We take note of the 21st report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL to international peace and security. Pakistan condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Few nations have done more for the success of the global counterterrorism efforts. Fewer still have bled more in this fight. Pakistan has been at the forefront on both counts, with 80,000 casualties and hundreds of billions of dollars in losses to our economy. Pakistan's sacrifices are unmatched. So is our resolve to eliminate this menace. I should recall that Al-Qaeda was largely decimated due to Pakistan's efforts. Today, we stand firm against Daesh and its affiliates, the Fitna al-Khawarij, TTP, BLA, and the Majid Brigade, that are actively collaborating in Afghanistan and the region, sharing resources, information, and physical space to carry out attacks against Pakistan. Mr. President, the Secretary General's report underlines the evolving danger. First, Daesh and its affiliates continue to pose serious threat to international peace and security. They continue to adapt and retain operational capabilities. Daesh affiliates are increasing concentration in Africa, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel. And this Council must make efforts to stem the mushrooming of terrorist entities in that region. Third, while Daesh has suffered setbacks in the Middle East, nearly 3,000 fighters are still entrenched across Iraq and Syria, and that is concerning. Fourth, the situation in Afghanistan remains precarious. With some 2,000 fighters, ISIL-K poses the most serious threat. Mr. President, indeed, terrorism within and from Afghanistan is the single most potent threat to that country, to the region, and the world. Although the Afghan interim government has been fighting ISIL-K, the threat from various other terrorist groups such as Fitna al-Khawarij, TTP, and Baloch militant groups having sought refuge in ungoverned spaces in Afghanistan remains unaddressed. For Pakistan, the danger is grave and immediate. The TTP, with nearly 6,000 fighters, is the largest UN-designated terrorist group operating from Afghan soil. With safe havens close to our borders, it directly threatens our national security. There is credible evidence of collaboration between the TTP and BLA and the Majid Brigade, including sharing of terrorist training camps that has targeted our strategic infrastructure, economic projects in Pakistan, and most tragically, our people. the Jafar Express passenger train hijacking and the holding of hostages by terrorists in March resulted in the loss of 31 innocent Pakistanis. Another terrorist attack on a school bus in Khusdar in May took 10 lives, 8 of them school-going children. These are not just numbers, these are stolen futures. And our principal adversary in the region is active in sponsoring terrorism in Pakistan. It bankrolls and supports terrorist proxies and carries out extraterritorial assassinations that have, in fact, gone global. Worse still, its blatant aggression against my country on the night of 6th and 7th of May this year, in violation of our sovereignty and international law, and under the false pretext of counterterrorism, deliberately and indiscriminately targeted civilian population and infrastructure, resulting in the martyrdom of 54 innocent Pakistani nationals, including 15 children, some of them infants, and 13 women. Mr. President, when state terrorism masquerades as counterterrorism, international peace is often the first casualty. This Council should not look away. Mr. President, terrorism today is not just on the battlefield. It is online, it is algorithm-driven, it is financed through digital shadows. Terrorist groups are experimenting in the digital space to glorify violence and exploit social media platforms for online radicalization and recruitment of youth, particularly vulnerable individuals. ICTs and AI are being misused by terrorist entities for propaganda and to organize and recruit online. Mr. President, we must respond with clarity and conviction and through a holistic approach. First, we must address the root causes of terrorism. And I thank USG Voronkov for reminding us again today about the imperative of prevention, the importance of a longer-term vision, and the crucial need to take measures aimed at addressing the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. In simple words, Pillar 1 of the GCTS merits our full attention. Second, we must address state terrorism and oppression. The situations in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir and the occupied Palestinian territories are the starkest examples where collective punishments against civilian populations, widespread grave violations of human rights, forced demographic changes, and fabricated counterterrorism narratives and unlawful actions are being deployed by the occupation forces to prolong and sustain the illegal occupations and undermine and deny the legitimate right to self-determination of the populations of these territories. I would stress, occupation cannot be dressed up as counterterrorism. Third, we must clearly distinguish between terrorism and the legitimate struggle of peoples against foreign occupation and for exercising their right to self-determination. Fourth, we need to make adequate changes to the sanctions regimes to incorporate new and emerging threats and end the dangerous stigmatization of Islam and Muslims. We must accept the reality. There has been a surge in the emergence of right-wing extremist and fascist movements in several countries and regions of the world, leading to terrorist violence. Yet, we see a strong inclination to see acts by non-Muslims not as terrorism, but often described just as violent crime. It is not understandable and is indeed unacceptable that every name on the Security Council's terrorism list is Muslim, while terrorists and violent extremists elsewhere escape scrutiny. There is no non-Muslim in the lists. This must change. This situation also contradicts the UN's and this Council's stated position that terrorism is a global phenomenon and it cannot and should not be associated with any religion, nationality, civilization, or ethnic group. Fifth, we must address and regulate new tools of terror and strengthen cooperation from Interpol to national law enforcement to choke off the digital arteries of terrorist networks. Mr. President, effective CT efforts require joint action, firmly anchored in consensus-based principles and embedded in the framework of international law. We can better succeed against terrorism through unity and cooperation, without double standards or discrimination, and by preventing its exploitation for politically motivated agendas that attempt to shift public opinion away from the real challenges that we face today. Double standards and political agendas are themselves the oxygen for terrorism. We can defeat terrorism by fighting it together and fighting it justly. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la delegación de...
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also extend appreciation to our esteemed briefers, Under Secretary General Voronkov, Assistant Secretary General Natalia Garman, for their comprehensive and timely briefings, and also Ms. Elisa Deanda Madrazo for her contribution. Sierra Leone welcomes the Secretary General's 21st report, which starkly states that the threat posed to Daesh by Daesh and its affiliates to international peace and security remained high during the reporting period. Despite sustained counterterrorism measures, Daesh continues to demonstrate regrettable notable resilience and adaptability, shifting tactics, exploiting instability, and expanding geographical participation into parts of Africa. Sierra Leone concurs with the Secretary General's assessment that while counterterrorism operations have constrained Daesh in the Middle East, its strategic orientation has shifted. Africa has become a new epicenter of operations with the highest intensity of violence observed in the Lake Chad Basin, the Sahel, and parts of East Africa. In our February intervention, Sierra Leone stressed three priorities that remain urgent today. First, tackling the root causes of terrorism. Extremist ideologies thrive where exclusion, unemployment, and poor governance prevail. Investing in education, economic opportunity, and inclusive governance is critical if we are to deny Daesh its affiliates the fertile ground on which they recruit. Second, addressing regional fragility must remain central to collective response. The report warns that ISIL affiliates are gaining autonomy in West Africa and the Sahel. Without coordinated action, these groups risk consolidating power, further weakening fragile states and destabilizing entire regions. Strengthening African-led responses such as the Abuja process, ensuring predictable funding for sub-regional standby forces like the ECOWAS Standby Force, and supporting initiatives including the MNGTF and the Accra Initiative remain essential to fostering ownership, sustainability, and effectiveness. Third, protecting vulnerable populations is a moral and security imperative. The expansion of Daesh's Fulkan office has feared violence and human rights abuses, targeting children, women, and minorities. Prioritizing protection, accountability, and humanitarian responses is not only an obligation under international law, but also a prerequisite for sustainable peace. The expansion of Daesh affiliates in Africa demands urgent attention. The report estimates that ISWAP alone commands between 8,000 to 12,000 fighters, supported by an influx of foreign terrorist fighters. In the Sahel, ISGS has sought to broaden its reach, while in East Africa, Daesh-linked groups in Somalia and Mozambique remain resilient. These developments underscore the urgency of enhanced border management, intelligence sharing, and regional solidarity. Equally troubling are the intersections between terrorism and organized crime, including arms trafficking, illegal resource exploitation, and smuggling networks across Libya, the Sahel, and the Great Lakes region. Such dynamics entrench instability, fuel violence, and fund terrorist operations. A comprehensive response must therefore integrate counterterrorism with peace building, disarmament, and socio-economic stabilization. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is also gravely concerned about the humanitarian crisis caused by terrorism, particularly in northeastern Syria, where approximately 34,800 individuals, including more than 20,000 children, remain in camps under dire conditions. As Secretary General warns, these facilities risk becoming incubators for radicalization and recruitment. We therefore join his call for member states to ensure the safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation of their nationals, consistent with international obligations and Security Council Resolution 2427 of 2018. Children in particular must be treated primarily as victims and granted access to protection and reintegration support. Sierra Leone emphasizes that the victims of terrorism, especially women and children, must remain at the heart of our global response. We welcome United Nations initiatives promoting gender response integration and community-based prevention, including psychosocial support, rehabilitation, and education. These must be scaled up in Africa, where communities continue to face the brunt of terrorism's human cost. Mr. President, at the policy level, Sierra Leone reaffirms its strong support for the 1267, 1989, 2253 ISIL-Daesh and Al-Qaeda sanctions regime. Effective, transparent, and objective use of sanctions remains a critical tool in disrupting financial networks and restricting terrorist mobility. We welcome the coordinated approach between the UN, United Nations, and the Financial Action Task Force, particularly in countering the misuse of emerging financial technologies. This strengthens collective capacity to address terrorist financing risks. Equally important is the role of criminal justice cooperation. The Secretary General's report documents significant progress in supporting national and regional legal frameworks, building investigative and prosecutorial capacities, and enhancing cross-border coordination. These are tangible steps that must be sustained and replicated. We therefore wish to highlight some positive movement, particularly on African-led initiatives, such as the Abuja process, as well as ongoing United Nations technical support. We encourage the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2719 of 2023 on sustainable financing for African Union-led peace support operations dedicated to countering terrorism. Sierra Leone welcomes efforts by the African Union in bolstering continental responses to terrorist threats, including through the operationalization of the African Union Plan of Action for the Prevention and Combating of Terrorism, AU Ministerial Committee of Counterterrorism, and the Comprehensive Continental Strategic Plan of Action on Countering Terrorism in Africa. We also call for deepened cooperation and collaboration between the AU and the UN in developing structured responses, especially tailored to the evolving ISIL-Daesh threat in Africa. This could include establishing early warning and rapid response mechanisms, information sharing platforms, and joint capacity building initiatives focused on operational, legal, and intelligence.
I thank the delegation of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. Thank you, President. I would like to thank USG Voronkov, the Executive Director of CTED, Ms. German, and the President of the Financial Action Task Force, Ms. Deanda Madrazo, for their briefings. President, this Council must remain mobilized to address the terrorist threat posed by Daesh, which remains significant. This threat continues to reshape itself throughout the world. In Africa, the Sahel has become the epicenter of international terrorism, which is spreading towards the Gulf of Guinea. Daesh is also strengthening its presence on the rest of the continent, notably in southern and eastern Africa. The ISKP from Afghanistan is the most active branch of the Islamic State and represents an acute threat to regional and international peace and security. The risk that terrorism will resurge in the Middle East, notably in Syria, is also a challenge. We expect the Syrian authorities to take all necessary measures to step up the fight against terrorism, working with their partners. Our determination to combat Daesh, wherever it seeks to take root, will not waver. France continues working within the international coalition to combat Daesh alongside its partners. This Council must gather together all tools at its disposal to provide a collective response to this threat. We must use the existing instruments, notably the sanctions regime established by Resolution 1267, to ensure that any individual or entity acting for Daesh, Al-Qaeda, or their affiliates be sanctioned and their capacity for action stamped out. We also call for the implementation of the sanctions established at the national or international level under Resolution 1373. Our work to combat terrorism must adapt to how the threat changes on the ground. France is ensuring to do this following three priorities. First of all, we aim to choke off the sources of financing of terrorism, to deal with the evil at its roots, and to strip terrorists of their means of action. France, since 2018, has worked with countries determined to cut off sources of financing of terrorism through the No Money for Terror initiative, and we hope to host the next conference for this initiative next year. The challenges in this domain are immense. Terrorist networks exploit any possible way offered by emerging technologies, and every day they invest in new virtual financial domains. France reiterates its support to the FATF. Its recent report, whose drafting was co-piloted by the DCT and France, stresses the need for bolstered international cooperation to deal with the way in which financing of terrorism risks are evolving. Our second priority is to combat the dissemination of terrorist content online. We need to beef up our society's resilience to deal with jihadist propaganda and to limit the capacities that terrorist networks online have to influence people. The swift progress of technology and AI provide innovative instruments for us to combat terrorist content and vilest extremist content online. They can also, however, be a source of additional vulnerability, and we must remain vigilant to this. This is one of the backdrops of the Christchurch appeal, which was launched by France and New Zealand, which became a foundation last year. Our third priority is to beef up our partners' capacity to combat terrorism. We must develop partnerships based on dialogue, meeting the needs that states have identified and people affected by terrorism, so as to build a common culture to combat this threat. This is the goal behind the International Academy of Counter-Terrorism in Jacquesville, which was launched in 2017 by France and Côte d'Ivoire. France also supports the UN Counterterrorism Office in the context of its program to protect vulnerable targets in West Africa. Finally, the fight against terrorism can only be effective and lasting if it occurs while fully respecting human rights and the rule of law. Thank you. I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the briefers. Colleagues, we are once again reminded that ISIL is far from defeated. The group continues to adapt, evolve, and exploit instability, both in the physical world and increasingly in the digital one. Let me highlight 3 points. First, the geography of the threat is shifting, but methods are also changing. Africa remains a key battleground, from the Sahel to Somalia, DRC, and Mozambique. Sahel alone now accounts for over half of global terrorism deaths, with spillovers into Benin, Togo, and other neighboring states. The international community must act together. This means investing in peace building, strengthening UN efforts on the ground, and supporting relevant, legitimate, and regionally led security frameworks. ISIL affiliates thrive in fragile environments, building influence through violence, propaganda, organized crime, and the exploitation of weak governance, often in settings where women and girls bear a disproportionate burden. What is also worrying in this report is the group's growing use of new technologies. We now see terrorists recruiting cyber experts and experimenting with AI for propaganda purposes. We also see how groups exploit new technology, including drones, cryptocurrencies, and encrypted networks to stay below the radar. These developments constitute a strategic shift which must be taken seriously. Terrorism is moving into new domains faster than many states and institutions are able to follow. We need to ensure that our shared tools and institutions are ready for these new challenges. The use of AI, cyber tactics, and other new technologies must be matched by modern and enforceable countermeasures. Second, we need to ensure our response is both agile and coordinated. Denmark supports the ongoing work to modernize the UN counterterrorism architecture. We need a system that is effective, accountable, and able to respond to threats that cross borders and platforms. At the same time, we must protect tools that work. Several delegations today have mentioned the 1267 regime. As chair of the 1267 committee, Denmark will continue to promote effective and principled sanctions against ISIL and its networks while safeguarding human rights and the rule of law. This includes supporting timely listings, regular updates, consistent follow-ups by member states, and the vital work of the ombudsperson. In this work, the efforts of UN entities and the FATF to help member states identify and detect and address terrorist financing risks are essential. Third and last, prevention must remain central. ISIL continues to exploit the online space to radicalize and recruit, especially young people. The UN and member states must step up efforts in digital literacy, community resilience, and counter-narratives grounded in human rights, the rule of law, and human dignity. We therefore welcome the initiatives highlighted in this report on engaging youth and preventing the misuse of gaming platforms and social media. But more is needed. Above all, practical and locally led initiatives that offer real alternatives, be it education, sports, or economic opportunities. At the same time, we must not lose sight of the offline realities that fuel radicalization and insecurity. In this regard, we welcome the increased repatriation efforts from the camps in northeast Syria. But tens of thousands still remain, including some 30,000 people in Al-Hol and Al-Rosh, 60% of which are children. With the future camp management uncertain, their continued confinement carries risks for security and human rights alike. Mr. President, in closing, ISIL is adapting, so must we. This means addressing root causes, but also responding to the new tools, tactics, and terrains of terrorism. Our counterterrorism efforts must evolve, not just in geography, but in mindset, coordination, and capability. Denmark remains committed to working with partners to shape a response that is principled, modern, and fit for purpose, and importantly, to ensure that the UN remains a relevant and effective platform in this effort. Thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de
I thank the delegation of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me at the outset to thank the Undersecretary General, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, the Executive Director, Ms. Natalia Gurman, and Ms. Elisa Deanda Madrazo, President of the Financial Action Task Force, for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, the threat of ISIS was highlighted in the Secretary General's 21st report and the 36th report of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. Terrorism, albeit a global threat, it is mostly felt in certain regions. The African continent has become today the hotspot facing the biggest threat following ISIS redirecting its strategy there. This was also stressed by our President, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, in his report to the African Union for fighting terrorism and preventing terrorism. He stressed that the terrorism threat in Africa is growing fast at an unprecedented level. It has become a complicated phenomenon that includes ideological violence, transnational organized crime, and armed insurgency. This is felt through the spread of terrorist groups sowing the seeds of terror in the continent and controlling lands. They are managing transnational criminal networks, increasing security threats. According to statistics, Africa faces an average of 8 terrorist attacks and 42 killings every day. As ISIS maintains fighters in Iraq and Syria, thousands of them, the Islamic State in West Africa province has become the most active spreading propaganda. They are taking advantage of their agility and adaptability. They are misusing advanced tools such as drones and artificial intelligence to promote their propaganda and to try to control land by establishing alternative control structures in light of the current fragilities. Fighting this threat requires a comprehensive, coordinated approach based on 6 key pillars. 1, addressing the root causes by combining security arrangements with development initiatives and by providing genuine opportunities for all sectors of society to deprive terrorism from a fertile terrain. Poverty is always targeted by extremists and recruiters. 2, promoting the response to technological challenges by coordinating international efforts to address the use by terrorists of advanced and emerging technologies. This cannot happen without building the capacities of developing countries and without the necessary technological transfers. 3, drying up the sources of funding for terrorist groups. Funding for terrorist groups is one of the most important tools for recruitment to ensure their terrorist threats. We stress the ultimate importance of the Algeria guiding principles to promote frameworks to prevent, detect, and disrupt the use of new and emerging financial technologies for terrorist purposes. 4, promoting cooperation with regional organizations, especially the African Union, which established an advanced institutional structure such as the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism. Regional organizations are best positioned to address security threats. 5, building sustainable local capacities. We firmly believe that genuine success requires strong institutions, comprehensive strategies, and effective partnerships. 6, and lastly, implementing social prevention initiatives that address the local stirrers of violent extremism. Such initiatives have proven successful in a number of areas. They include awareness campaigns that reduce polarization among the youth, which are the most vulnerable to recruitment. Mr. President, we renew our firm commitment to the implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and relevant Security Council resolutions. We stand ready to share our experiences and support initiatives to end the terrorist threat. In conclusion, we stress that any effective countering of terrorism should balance between security and sustainable development, because we firmly believe in this basic principle. There can be no development without peace and no peace without development. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I will now deliver a statement as the representative of Panama. Your Excellencies, we would like to welcome USG of UNOCT, Mr. Voronkov, the Executive Director of CTED, Ms. German, and the President of the Financial Action Task Force, Ms. Deanda Madrazo. We'd like to welcome them and thank them all very much for their comprehensive briefings. And we'd like to thank them for their coordination to allow us to hear from you all today. Terrorism is not on the back foot. It is adapting, it is changing. Our response must therefore be commensurate with the way in which it is evolving. ISIL and Al-Qaeda have stepped up their presence in Africa, a region where weak governance and the informal economies allows them to consolidate their operations. The Sahel has become a particular source of concern. Groups such as JNIM have modernized their operational capacity. They use drones, IEDs, and they carry out complex attacks. In addition to attacking, they aim to control, govern, and impose themselves as legitimate actors. Fighters from other regions are reaching areas such as the Lake Chad Basin, bringing with them operative experience and access to technologies. This movement is also making it possible for dormant cells to be revived. Other regions are also facing significant risks. The terrorist threat can move easily. It can make the most of structural weaknesses to establish new areas of operation. Any response that does not acknowledge this reality is doomed to fail. Syria remains an unstable epicenter as well. In the northeast of the country, people detained in facilities associated with alleged ties with terrorist groups, including children, remain without any access to legal recourse. These conditions have made these areas ripe for radicalization. Violent ideology has not disappeared. It has only adapted, and it persists. In Afghanistan, ISIL-K continues to represent a serious threat, projecting its influence towards Central Asia and even beyond that. Its propaganda is sophisticated. It is targeted and adapted, tailored to different platforms, exploiting local loopholes. Institutions cannot leave these areas without any response. Distinguished colleagues, the link between terrorism and transnational crime has also deepened. Drug trafficking, the smuggling of persons, illegal fishing, people trafficking, the trafficking of natural resources, and illegal mining are sources of financing of these groups. Maritime infrastructure remain vulnerable as well. We urgently need to beef up the joint programs working with the International Maritime Organization in order to protect ports, commercial routes, and logistical chains from possible attacks. The ways in which terrorism is financed continue to change. Some small, unaffiliated cells operate with scant resources, but nevertheless with a great degree of impact. They use pseudo-anonymous transfer methods and informal mechanisms outside of the regulated system, and new technologies based on blockchain. This evolution requires us to be constantly vigilant and flexible. Digital platforms, social media, and video games have also become tools for radicalization and financing. The Financial Action Task Force has raised the alarm about the urgent need to adapt to these new forms of threats. We need to build up a robust legal architecture which can be adaptable and clearly defines responsibilities and solidifies oversight mechanisms. The use of artificial intelligence by terrorist groups is also a present reality. That is why integrating AI into the counter-terrorist strategy is not an option, it is essential. Against this backdrop, the narrative is very important. Radicalizing agents have understood how to tell stories and to capture audiences, and we must do the same and more. Education and prevention must go hand in hand with a clear communication strategy and accountability tailored to modern technologies. Panama wishes to reaffirm its commitment to the multilateral architecture to combat terrorism, in line with the UN's counterterrorism strategy and the Global Coordination Compact for the anti-terrorist fight. At the national level, we have beefed up the oversight of non-financial subjects, adopting clear definitions on final beneficiaries, and we have developed adaptable, flexible legal frameworks. All of this has beefed up our own ability to pinpoint risks. We also reaffirm the shared responsibility in the designations of jurisdictions who do not fulfill international standards in terms of financial security. It is unfair that we see double standards existing. The application of these mechanisms must be universal, it must be consistent, and it must be applied both to countries and to their dependent territories. Panama calls on strengthening official development aid as a tool for prevention. We know that where international institutions withdraw, other stakeholders will take their place. The weakening of international assistance is not just a political risk factor, it is also a direct risk factor. The sanctions committees must also modernize. The designations must be governed by technical criteria, not political criteria. That is why the monitoring group needs constant support without any interference. Colleagues, we reaffirm the importance of a system that effectively punishes those who finance terrorism, without compromising neutral and impartial humanitarian assistance. Sanctions must be specific, proportionate, and based on clear evidence. It is critical to stick to the principles of justice and fundamental freedoms. This Council's legitimacy hinges on the effectiveness of its tools. Politicizing the sanctions committees weakens the entire system and jeopardizes lives. The counterterrorism fight cannot just be based on military responses. It must be anchored in legality, cooperation, innovation, and prevention. A system that is not adapted ends up collapsing. The Security Council was not established to protect the interests of the most powerful countries and their allies. It was established to uphold international peace and security for all people throughout the world. Thank you very much.